In this session of environmental law, we'll look into Unit 4 and we'll look into the topic of sustainable development, primarily focusing on the concept of environmental impact assessment, environmental audit, and India and sustainable development. Environmental impact assessment is a technique to ensure that the likely effects of developmental activities on the environment will be taken into consideration before the development activity is actually authorized to proceed. So, environmental impact assessment, it systematically identifies, predict and assess the actual and potential environmental consequences of a project before the project is actually approved. The environmental impact assessment process ensures the proponent take a proper responsibility in order to minimize the environmental impacts of their proposed projects. Once the decision makers and other stakeholders use information generated from the environmental impact assessment, they process to identify environmental management options and to decide if and how the project will be proceeded. Environmental impact assessment gives a chance to adopt or modify a scheme in order to mitigate adverse environmental consequences and for taking environmental dimension into account to project in order to get ahead with the project decision. The technique of environmental impact assessment, if we look at its origin, it finds its place from, it has its origin from precautionary principle, which requires refusal of consent or approval of the developmental activity by the competent authority if the project poses threat of serious or irreversible environmental damage. In order to determine the serious or irreversible nature of the environmental effects on of the developmental activity, the project makers, this whole question of environmental impact assessment becomes all the more necessary. As we know that the precautionary principle mandates that the environmental impact assessment should be made obligatory for developmental activities which are likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment. In the case of environmental impact assessment, it reveals that the developmental activities poses threat of serious or reversible environmental damage. The competent authority must withhold the consent for approval or permission to such activity. When we look at precautionary principle, it mandates that the environmental impact assessment should be carried out not only at the time of commencement of developmental project, but even during the operation of the project. The environmental impact assessment involves continuing assessment and evaluation of environmental effects on the developmental project as long as the project is in operation and is not confined to pre-project evaluation of possible environmental effects. The environmental impact assessment is a continuous process, hence, and is focused on the continuity and on terms of monitoring the environmental consequences of the developmental activity, because it's not possible to anticipate that all the environmental consequences of a proposed developmental project at the time of its commencement only. Hence, the precautionary principle insists upon the continuing feature of environmental impact assessment as long as the developmental activity continues. The continuing environmental assessment is the mandate of the precautionary principle. Now we'll look into certain common components which are being shared regarding the environmental impact assessment, the processes which differs between countries and projects, but there are several components which are there between countries when it comes to environmental impact assessment, like screening, which is required for environmental impact assessment. It tells us about at what level of detail is required. Scoping, that tells us about the what are the issues impact of the project, who are the stakeholders, what is the current state of environment. Identification of alternatives, like it tells us about what all alternative exist when it comes to environmental projects. or the projects which can have impact on environment. Impact analysis: what are the environmental, social and other related impacts of the project. Mitigation and impact management: how will the impact be mitigated, reduced or managed. Evaluation of significance tells us about the impacts which will be acceptable. Preparation of an environmental impact statement or report: now this is the document of the proposal impacts and consisted of impact mitigation and management options, levels of significance and concerns. Then next component is review of environmental impact uh, statement. Now we have an environmental impact statement which is open for public comment for a sufficient period of time. Then we have decision making: public comments considered and a decision made whether to accept the proposal as it is, or to modify it, or to reject the proposal outright would be there. Monitoring and review: now to develop an implementation plan, being monitoring, and it's very important to monitor it and then review the project. And then after that we have environmental auditing, which is a management tool which simply inspects the environmental management activities performed by the industries or organization and make them aware about the new, cleaner and greener technologies. When we look at the concept of environmental audit, we find that it consisted of auditing in terms of it's a tool which helps in simply inspecting the environmental management activities performed by the industries or organization and makes them aware of new, cleaner technology. So it's a continuous process and involves reviewing of both the organization and management in relation to environmental performance, following a systematic examination of operations in an environmental context, considering emissions, effect on local communities, landscape, ecosystem, and resulting in reports on areas for improved performance, like the environmental impact assessment, which is a continuous process, and the basic feature of environmental audit is also based on the principle of caution and embodies the obligation of continuing watchfulness and caution. The concept of environmental audit has two levels basically. The first one is self assessment of the environmental effects of the activities and the external verification of the audit by an independent body. So the continual nature of the concept requires that the developers must draw up annual environment statement and which shall be audited by independent auditors. The environmental audit authorities concerned and the public must have access to the reports of the environmental auditors in order to implement the precautionary principle, which strengthens the edges of environmental jurisprudence. Environmental audit must be made mandatory at the international as well as the national level. When we look into India and sustainable development, we see that the India is currently in the dire need of charting out a new political economy of sustainable development to balance these imperatives that are seemingly conflictual in the shorter run, but certainly mutually reinforcing from the perspective of long-run human development. Broadly, this will imply a development process with deepening of economic activities at a large scale, as to also include the entire population in the developmental process. Arguably, with the time of development trajectory, it's becoming increasingly environmentally efficient, and the concern of climate change imperatives requires that the both development and deployment of climate-friendly technologies happens in a shorter time frame and at a global scale also. In a globally integrated economic order now, we are faced with the global environmental challenge with serious national implications. To what extent now it will be interesting for us to see that India can craft and pursue such a political economy of sustainable development. That would be the key question today, not only for India as is the world's largest democracy, but arguably for the world too.